Hello, everyone. My name is Alex Colvin, and I'm the Public Programs Curator at the Alabama Department of Archives and History. Welcome to our virtual Food for Thought. So I have a few updates and announcements I want to give you before we join our program. So today I'd like to invite you to join us again virtually on Thursday, October 1st at noon for a special program on wiregrass suffragist Scotty Mackenzie Frazier. And this will be presented by Dr. Hayden McDaniel, one of our education curators. I'd also like to invite you again next month to join us for next month's Food for Thought on October 15th, when Dr. Lisa Dorr will present 1,000 Thirsty Beaches, Rum Running to the South. Today, I get the distinct pleasure to introduce you to Ryan Blocker. She is our museum's collections coordinator, and she is the most recent past president of the Alabama Museums Association. She has a bachelor's in history from Auburn University at Montgomery and a certification in collections care focusing on textile conservation and preservation from the International Preservation Study Center in Illinois. She has a passion for women's history and historic textiles, and today she will be presenting No Votes for Women, Alabama's Anti-Suffragists. So without further ado, welcome Ryan.
Hello, everyone. I'm very excited to be here today to talk to you about the Alabama anti-suffrage movement. Not many people know of or even realize that the state of Alabama had one of the most active and successful anti-suffrage organizations in the South. In fact, they were so successful that leaders of the Alabama Association were asked to travel to other states, assisting with the organization and mobilization of the Southern anti-suffrage movement as a whole. Now, I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. However, I do want to mention this one point before we start. When I first became interested in the suffrage movement years ago, I was shocked to realize that the most vocal leaders of the opposition were in fact women. These were women with positions of power and standing in their community. And I had truly expected that all anti-suffrage members were also members of this elite clubhouse that you'll see here. As a child of the 1970s and the second wave feminist movement, I had incorrectly assumed that all women had petitioned for and even desired equal suffrage. As I delved deeper into the history of the suffrage movement, I realized that this was more than just an issue of gender equality. It was also an issue of race and class. With that said, I hope that after this talk, you, like myself, are fascinated by the history of the anti-suffrage movement and the lasting effects its ideology would have on future women's movements in the South. So with that in mind, I've put together this agenda to give you an idea of the progression of my talk. First, we'll take a look at the anti-suffrage movement on the national level, and then focus in on the organization and leadership at the state level. Finally, we'll take a closer look at the ideology behind the anti-suffrage movement and how they used it in propaganda. So, the first organized anti-suffrage activity in the United States occurred in Massachusetts in 1868, when opponents of women's suffrage conducted a statewide petition drive against enfranchisement. Organization on a national level didn't occur until 1911, when the National Association Opposed to Women's Suffrage is formed after the women of California were granted the right to vote. The timing for the formation of the national organization was purposeful. The antis suspected that the suffragists were so encouraged by their California victory that they would soon begin deploying their forces into the eastern states. So from 1911 to 1917, under the direction of then President Josephine Dodge, the national organization had this really focused vision for their opposition, where they held petition drives, they were lobbying in state houses, and they began active letter writing campaigns. Josephine even traveled the country speaking on behalf of the organization, and it was during her tenure that the suffrage movement saw major setbacks. In 1915 alone, suffragists lost important referenda in New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Massachusetts. In 1917, however, things began to fall apart at the national level. In the midst of a major campaign to oppose the New York suffrage amendment, Josephine Dodge resigns her position as the president of the national organization. She is very quickly replaced by Alice Wadsworth, wife of then New York Senator James Wadsworth Jr. According to the national organization, this change was a tactical decision. The fight against a federal amendment, which they could see coming on the horizon, would necessitate a woman in charge who lived in DC and had very strong political connections. And in their eyes, Mrs. Wadsworth fit the bill. Within a few months, the national headquarters was moved from New York to DC, and all of the remaining founding officers had been replaced. The results of this change in leadership was a very visible change in the motivation of the organization. The National Association floundered under Wadsworth's leadership with dwindling public activities, a slowdown in the organizational drive, and a loss of that dynamic focus that the organization saw under Josephine Dodge. Another blow came in November of 1917 when New York voted for women's suffrage in a statewide referendum. Then, in September of 1918, President Wilson reversed his previous opposition to women's suffrage and actually proposed that a federal women's suffrage amendment be passed as a wartime measure. So on June 4th, 1919, the Senate passes the 19th Amendment by the required 2/3 vote. Congress had done its part. Now it was passed to the states for ratification. 36 states were needed for ratification, but the antis realized that they only needed 13 to oppose. 2 days after this announcement, Alice Wadsworth resigns her position with the national organization and publishes her resignation statement in the New York World. Now, I'm going to read just a small excerpt from her published statement because it really has an impact on the national organization and not in a good way. I quote, "In view of the fact that there is no time limit placed on the ratification of the women's suffrage amendment, it seems to me that it would be entirely useless to make any further fight against suffrage." She adds, "This is simply my own opinion, my own personal opinion. I'm not speaking for my organization in any official way." And she continues by saying that if there had been a time limit placed on the ratification of the amendment by the various states, that she believed the fight could have been continued by the anti-suffragists. But with the passage of the amendment without any time limit on it, the use for a national action was ended, and she didn't think that they would want to continue a struggle that would last indefinitely. This sent the national organization into damage control, with their first concern being to reassure the public that one, they were still very much involved in the fight, and two, Wadsworth was speaking only for herself and not the entire movement. It became apparent that it would be up to the individual states to stop the amendment in its tracks. So, as we look at the anti-suffrage organization at the state level, it's important to note that the period between 1916 and 1919 saw little activity in southern states for the anti-suffrage movement. Antis in the South had adopted this wait and see mentality where they tried to gauge the direction the suffrage movement would take in the conservative state houses of the South. After congressional passage of the 19th Amendment, the individual state organizations realized that they would need to take up the battle. On June 17th, 1919, the supporters of anti-suffrage in Alabama heed the call to action with the formation of the Women's Anti-Ratification League of Alabama. The organization of the Anti-League in Alabama happens very quickly. Under the leadership of Nina Pinkard, the Antis mobilize an aggressive membership drive with weekly meetings and the collection of protest petitions for the state legislature. When the Alabama state legislature convened in July of 1919, the Anti-Ratification League sent the letter pictured here from the archives collection, actually, to each member. In this letter, they put forth some of the basic arguments that we will hear again and again from the Antis. First, though, they want to point out that those poor senators that passed the 19th Amendment were truly against it in their hearts, that they had been politically sandbagged by the suffragists and they were pressured to vote in favor. They also claimed that the amendment was a violation of states' rights and that it dishonored, and I quote, the principle for which the Confederate soldier shed his blood. They appealed to the legislatures as true men of the South to decline the ratification of the amendment. They point out that their fathers had not voted for the 15th Amendment, so why should they vote for the 19th? The League also claimed that, hey, they would support a state-regulated enfranchisement, but in their estimation, women in Alabama really didn't want the vote. This propaganda that women really didn't want the vote was repeated in publications and leaflets like this one. Here, the Antis state that the lack of Alabama women on the membership rolls of the state suffrage organization proved that women in the state were opposed to their own enfranchisement. In fact, they posed this question: should the home-loving women be thrust into a condition that to them would be distasteful and intolerable in order that the craving for power of a few misguided women shall be satisfied? That's provocative language. Basically, they're stating the Antis were proper women that wanted to live within their own separate home sphere, and they didn't want to be bothered by the distasteful and intolerable sphere that was the world of men and politics. Plainly spoken, a woman's place was in the home and not in politics. They also painted the picture of suffragists as these misguided, power-hungry women that were forcing their ideals on the poor women of Alabama that were, by nature, unfit to bear this responsibility. Things heat up between the Antis and the pro-suffrage parties as both sides begin their fight for support in the State House. In July, the July 1919 article on the left from the Montgomery Advertiser illustrates how both groups converged on the State House in hopes of winning over prospective legislative supporters. Legislators demonstrated their support by wearing the color of their chosen campaign. If they supported the anti-ratification campaign, they would wear a red rose pinned to their lapel. If they supported the suffrage movement, they wore a yellow rose. Despite pressure to support either campaign, the governor claimed neutrality. However, in July of 1919, he was seen wearing an anti-suffrage rose. According to the article, when questioned, he explained that he was caught in his office by the Antis, and the rose was pinned to his jacket for all of 5 minutes before it was removed and put in a souvenir box. Despite the incident, he continued to maintain that he would remain hands-off during this fight. Now, you can imagine that the governor and the majority of Alabama legislators felt like the poor politicians seen in this image from the Tennessee State Archives. Alabama politicians were caught in the crossfire between the Antis and the suffragists with little room to escape. As the date for Alabama's vote drew near, tensions between the suffragists and the Antis began building. When an anonymous letter is sent to members of the Anti-Ratification League and the state legislators, it implied several things about the motives of the Antis. Number one, the Antis campaign was financed by special interest groups like the textile and liquor industries. Now, I do have to say that these industries had valid concerns about women getting the vote. The textile industries feared that women would outlaw child labor and create minimum wage and maximum hours laws. And the liquor industry feared that suffrage would lead to temperance. Now, the second thing that the letter implied was this. Although the antis claimed that the sphere of politics was no place for women, they had no problem lobbying in the State House. In fact, they seemed to relish these newfound positions. Now, as an aside, I just want to say that there is some irony or hypocrisy, if you will, to anti-suffrage activism, because it pushed into political activity women who insisted that women were unsuited for politics. The anti-reaction to this anonymous letter was swift. They immediately sought legal counsel and threatened to sue anyone that repeated these libelous claims that they were financed by the liquor industry. They published their retort in the Montgomery Advertiser during the anonymous letter writer to prove or stand suit. The piece on the right, also from the Montgomery Advertiser, was published the same day as the article on the left. This brief opinion piece sums up the public sentiment about the affair. Politicians grow scared when they think of fighting for or against women in politics. As the legislature began its deliberations on the measure, the antis sent the petition seen here, which they called a memorial, to be read aloud by 2 state senators. The antis felt that it would be inappropriate to appear before the legislator in person, and they wanted to avoid what they called unfamiliar and distasteful role of political gladiators. Claiming to represent the majority of Alabama women, the memorial reminded the legislators that adoption of the amendment would forfeit the right of the state to regulate its own election laws and would transfer power to a government that was not in sympathy with the social order in Alabama. The memorials combine appeals to chivalry, states' rights, and white supremacy appear to have made the desired impact that the antis wanted, because Alabama's legislature votes no for ratification of the suffrage amendment. The successful outcome of the campaign seemed only to whet the appetites of the Alabama anti-suffragists for political activism. With their success, the Alabama Anti-Ratification League decided to maintain its offices and the organization so that they would be ready to fight other manifestations of feminism. With this in mind, the League rebrands itself as forgive me for how long this title is, the Southern Women's League for the Rejection of the Susan B. Anthony Amendment, and they decided to retain Nina Pinkard as president. Alabama anti-suffragists planned for the Rejection League to be this regional organization that would help organize neighboring states. They proclaimed that its purpose would be to cooperate with anti-suffrage organizations that were already in existence. And in states which had no such organizations, the League would be there to organize and take up the fight. The Southern Rejection League primarily concerned itself with the federal constitutional amendment. Its major arguments always concerned states' rights, the loss of white supremacy, and the fear of the enfranchisement of Black voters. This can be seen in their Declaration of Principles, pictured here from the Tennessee State Archives. Now, I've just pulled out a few of their declarations to show you the strong language that they're using. First, they state that state sovereignty was essential, especially in the South, and that the federal government had no understanding of the South's peculiar social and racial problems, and that they would oppose any measure that threatened the continuation of Anglo-Saxon domination. From the fall of 1919 to the summer of 1920, Nina Pinkard traveled to states across the South assisting with anti-ratification campaigns. As the battle for ratification narrowed to Tennessee for the deciding vote, Nina, along with other members of the National Organization and the Southern Rejection League, arrived at the Hotel Hermitage in Nashville. They were met by Josephine Pearson, president of the Tennessee division of the Rejection League. Josephine had secured the hotel's mezzanine and the assembly rooms as their anti-ratification headquarters. This image from the Tennessee State Archives was taken in front of one of the assembly rooms in the Hermitage Hotel. Nina on the left is seen posing with a Confederate flag. Josephine Pearson is on the right. And I think they found the oldest Confederate veteran in the state of Tennessee and posed him in the center. There is a lot of heavy symbolism in this image. That it likens the crusade of the anti-suffrage movement with the states' rights narrative of the Civil War. In the end, campaign efforts by the antis in Tennessee failed to produce the success that they had seen in other states. On August 18th, 1920, Tennessee becomes the 36th and final state needed to ratify the amendment. Against the objection of the antis, women were now guaranteed the right to vote. So in the previous slides, we've covered the national organization and the development of the state organization. Now it's time to take a look at the leaders and supporters of the Alabama suffrage movement. We'll start with Nina Pinkard, who we've heard about recently. She was the most highly visible anti-suffrage leader in the entire region. An Alabama native, Nina was born into an old and very politically powerful family. Her participation in the anti-suffrage movement was likened to a crusade as she undertook this challenge to ensure that all Southern states rejected ratification. In her words, Nina saw the anti-suffrage movement as a mighty reform that fought off a moral threat that was women's suffrage. Also involved in the anti-suffrage movement is Marie Bankhead Owen. Like Nina, she came from a prominent political family in Alabama, which included 2 U.S. senators and a congressman. Marie's opposition to the federal amendment was twofold. First, she believed voting to be a states' right issue. And second, she feared that a suffrage amendment would provide an opportunity for Black voters to enter the electorate. Her involvement in the anti-suffrage movement was curtailed by the death of her husband, Tom, in March of 1920. With his death, her focus turns to her husband's legacy as she becomes the second director of the Alabama Department of Archives and History. Our next supporter of the anti-suffrage movement is Senator Oscar Underwood. A conservative politician from Alabama, Underwood's opposition to women's suffrage was not because of an objection to women voting. In fact, in his speech to the Senate in 1919, he said this, that there are far more disastrous powers to place in the hands of women than that of the exercise of the elective franchise. Underwood's objection to suffrage stemmed from his belief that passage of the amendment would centralize power with the federal government. He believed that this would destroy the principle of self-government and would lead to the disintegration of the nation. At this point, we'll take a look at the anti-suffrage ideology and the arguments that the antis would use to support it. So in these theological arguments, they believe that men and women lived in separate spheres that were ordained by God, and that the subordination of women in the church and in society had biblical support and was the literal will of God. In other words, man had been created to be the head of the household, and suffrage would go against the duties that God had assigned. For the biological arguments, they said that women were physically unfit for the types of activity that public life required. According to the Virginia Association opposed to women's suffrage, there were mental and emotional differences between men and women that should prevent women from being forced into political strife or from having additional responsibilities thrust upon them. Anti-suffragists frequently turned to scientific evidence to prove that biology rendered women incapable of public life. And if a woman entered this realm, it was to the detriment of themselves and their children. They had experts weigh in. Professor Max Schlapp, a Cornell University professor, produced statistics for the anti-suffrage movement that said if women were enfranchised, motherhood would become rarer as the cause of suffrage gained. Dr. Charles Dana, a neurophysiologist, said that feminism put an unbearable strain on the unburdened woman and predicted that suffrage would cause, and I quote, 25% more insanity than they have now. And he continues by saying, I'm not saying that women's suffrage will make women crazy, but I do say that women's suffrage would throw into the electorate a mass of voters with delicate nervous stabilities. The states' rights arguments. This was the belief that women's suffrage, if obtained by an amendment to the federal government, would be an infringement on the right of the states to control their own electorates. This meant federal control over elections, which in the minds of many white Southerners meant the destruction of the Democratic Party that had been the main agency for the protection of white supremacy. Now, the argument that women's suffrage would mean the loss of white supremacy, to put it simply, white Southerners feared the potential power of Black voters. Anti-suffragists warned that the Black majority would dominate the South. In their eyes, giving the well-born, educated white women the vote would be offset by the masses of the poor and the lower classes and the Black women that would enter the electorate. Southern anti-suffragists wished to protect as long as possible the lasting remains of the past with its clearly defined racial, gender, and class regulations. The sociological arguments, these arguments were derived from the assumption that family, not the individual, served as the basic unit of society. Suffrage would allow women to vote as individuals, and men would no longer vote as the sole expression of the needs of the family. Society, even civilization itself, would crumble into chaos if women broke away from the family and established individualism. This also brings into the argument the doctrine of separate spheres, which we talked a little bit about earlier. This doctrine believed that women possessed enormous power within the sphere of the family or the home unit. They even wielded political power, but it was a power that was, through their influence as wives and mothers. In other words, they could influence the men who would be their representatives at the polls. The separate spheres, it was believed, provided women with guarantees of protection, and crossing over the line that divided the spheres could be dangerous. It could produce masculine women and feminine men. Now we'll take a look at the propaganda produced by the anti-suffrage movement. Here in this leaflet, America When Feminized, the antis are playing on the fear that women's suffrage would weaken the power held by white males. According to this leaflet, a weakening of the manpower of nations had been but a pre-runner of decadence in civilizations. In their minds, suffrage was unnatural and denatured both men and women. The postcard and posters seen here play on the fear that suffrage would reverse gender roles. Men would be left at home to take up the slack of their politically active wives. My favorite piece of propaganda, and I've left this one for the last, is a pro-suffrage political cartoon that mocks the idea that suffrage would mean the end of domesticity. In the cartoon, you can see the family hiding in fear as they await the disintegration of the home and the defeminization of their wife and mother. She is likened to a ticking time bomb that is ready to explode with the passage of suffrage amendment. So I felt that the perfect way to end this talk was to ask this question: what happened in Alabama after ratification? The best way to answer this is to look at the first election following ratification. In the November 1920 election, over 123,000 women registered to vote in the state, and 23,000 of those were in Jefferson County alone. More people voted that year than ever before. In fact, a record amount of people voted, and women counted for 1/3 of that vote. This was a remarkable achievement for a state in which opponents had claimed that Alabama women did not want the vote. I thank you so much. That's the end of my talk. And I hope that you have learned something new about the suffrage movement and the anti-suffragists, and look forward to hearing questions from you.
Ryan, thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. We do, as Ryan said, we have some time for questions. So if you have any questions about the presentation, anti-suffragists, just put them in the comments below and we'll be able to see them and share them with Ryan. But to start off, I would like to ask you kind of this broad question. This year is, of course, the centennial of the 19th Amendment. So we've had programs from the archives from around the state, around the nation, but a lot of them have focused on the suffragists, right? The fight for the vote. But today you have shown us, in a wonderful presentation, you've shown us this other side to the commemoration, the anti-suffragists. Why do you think that we should include them in our commemoration, and what can we learn from the story of the anti-suffragists?
Oh, that's a good question, Alex. Thank you. Well, I think that to get a complete picture of the suffrage movement, you need to be able to see both sides of the argument. Suffrage was not guaranteed. It was a fight for women to gain their own enfranchisement. Also, the ideology and arguments used by the antis were repeated later in the civil rights movement, and then again during the push for the Equal Rights Amendment. So I think it's important that we understand the basis of those ideologies and those arguments.
That's great. Yeah, it's so perfect example of the fact that, there's two sides to every argument. To really appreciate the victory that was won, sometimes you have to see who they were fighting against, right?
Yes.
So I love that. That's a perfect way to say it. All right, so we do have a question from an audience member, so I'm going to share it here with you. Were there any additional pushbacks after November 1920? So, were there any other kind of moments where women in Alabama were having trouble with the vote?
Well, I haven't done that research. Hey, Madison, I haven't done that research yet, but I do know that when the amendment was ratified in Tennessee, the anti-suffragists immediately brought legal action to try to halt it and reverse it. So I know that immediately after there was pushback, but later on in 1920, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I know that from my own examination to it, I don't think there was any kind of attempt to, as far as I know, to repeal it later. Yeah. There was, of course, still problems for, some African-American citizens, just like you mentioned, that this movement is, very, and the interceptors show us that it's a very kind of hard movement in regards to race in Alabama. But I agree, I haven't seen anything that has shown us that there was any attempt to repeal it after. Well, I have another question for you. Okay. And if y'all have any more, just keep sending them. That was a great question, Madison. So another question that I have is about, you talk about this irony, right? That these women are kind of anti-political, but they're political in their actions. And I'm thinking especially of Marie Bankhead Owen, right? So we're both here at the archives. And one year in 1919, she's a part of this movement that's saying women should be in the home. And the very next year, in 1920, she becomes the director of the Alabama Department of Archives and History. How do you think they kind of balanced out the kind of the irony or the hypocrisy? So I guess what was their real motivation in acting out in this way?
Well, that letter that I mentioned earlier that accused them of sort of, loving being in this politically active sphere, their reply to that accusation was that they relished their newfound political activism, was just that they didn't step into the political sphere because they wanted to. They felt that they had to, and they did it because they didn't want others to be made to, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
But, too, especially for women like Marie Bankhead Owen, these women were born into positions of power and influence. They feared that giving other classes and races the ability to vote would dilute, or actually probably diminish is a better word, their power that they already had.
So it's really the motivation for this is keeping that power.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, wow. And so that makes sense, though, why it would be in her mind not really against her same motivation to then become the director of the archives later. So they kind of are hand in hand with what their objective is. And also, I remember Scotty, who works with us, he made a point one time to say that Marie, in one point, maybe wasn't against suffrage as an idea. She just didn't really want it to be a federal amendment. So she's an even more complicated character than some of the other ones, but they're all very interesting. We have another question, this one from Kelly Smith. Was there opposition that made it difficult for women to actually vote after ratification, as we saw for African Americans when they were legally able to vote? So even though they were given that right, was there kind of a difficulty for women to register?
Well, you had some counties that when, for instance, when African Americans would go to the vote, they had to take tests and do that. And you would think that the same thing would apply for women, but unfortunately, what I've run across, it didn't happen for white women. Yeah.
So not necessarily a lot of the same restrictions that are happening for African Americans for women.
Exactly.
So once it's kind of there, people vote. And do you think people like Marie Bankhead Owen and Nina Pinker, do you think they were out there voting?
I would be interested to find out when they registered to vote. That's been something I need to dig a little deeper and see if I could find out, because I would be more interested in Nina Pinker than I would Marie Bankhead Owen, to see when she stepped up and registered. I do think it's funny, though, that Alabama didn't ratify the 19th Amendment until after Nina Pinker died. It's like they didn't want to do it while she was still living.
She was still a looming figure at the time. Yeah. So we have another question here from Madison. I noticed a lot of the resources used in the presentation were from the Tennessee archives. Could it be from Owens directing the ADH, or am I pulling strings? So is there a reason why we maybe don't have as many of the
a lot of actually what I did show, I just didn't point out every time something was from the archives, but a lot of the information that I pulled was from the archives. But, Tennessee being the state that was the last to ratify and pass the amendment, or ratify the amendment, if you will, they tended to have gathered a lot more of that information. And we're still in the process here at the archives of processing. We've made it a priority to process women's collections here. So are going to be finding more material in the future.
Exactly. I know that I think we put it in one of the comments here, but we have this year really expanded our digital collection and added one specifically for women's suffrage. And as we found kind of archival collections and all these different, they're all spread out. Some of them are together, but some of them are in individual women's collections. We've brought them all together in this digital collection so that you can kind of go and see both pro and anti-suffrage documents that we have. So it is something we're kind of building out. And then we have one question. Can you speak some about poll taxes? So some of maybe those restrictions that were against voters at the time.
Not for, I don't know for this period, but, later in the civil rights movement, you see this, you'll have to help me here, Alex. There, I know that they, some of them had to take tests. Some of them had to pay a tax before they would be able to vote. What else am I missing, Alex?
Definitely literacy tests.
Literacy tests, yes.
I've seen some who especially in regards to women specifically, like in Jefferson County, I found one newspaper source that was talking about an African-American woman going, and when she's there, they ask her to explain the process of ratification of an amendment. And then after she completes that, they ask her to recite the Constitution. And she refuses to do that. They then say, well, then if you can find someone who can vouch for you, then maybe we'll do it. She waits a few hours. She has a couple people there who vouch for her as a good citizen. But then when she goes up, they say, well, you waited too long to bring them, even though she was waiting in the office. Like, so we're going to have to reject your registration. And it's each county, across the state, they had things from poll taxes and literacy tests, grandfather clauses, all these different things. And it was really kind of a picking and choosing in which registrar's office you were in, of what they would really emphasize. There were some African-American women who were able to register to vote in 1920, but a large portion of them, these different restrictions hurt their ability to join. For some white women, they were able to come in for poll taxes in particular, because there was this question, are they going to have to be, is the poll tax going to be cumulative? So the moment they turn 21, are we going to go back and say, well, now you owe us this much, or does it start this year? And they decided that it would start this year. So some women were able to kind of vote when their husbands weren't, some poorer women, because their poll tax was a smaller number. So they were able to kind of vote. But it's a very complicated and messy situation. But another great question from audience. We have time, I think, for maybe one more. And I want to ask one more, that something I was just thinking about as I was coming in to your presentation. You have this wonderful overview, right, of the kind of motivations for why these women were thinking what they were thinking, right? And I just was wondering, because I know that's from the Southern perspective, is this the same kind of motivations that are happening across the nation at national level? I'm thinking especially about the question of race. Is that as big of a problem outside of the South and as big of a motivation, or is that something unique to this region?
Well, my study has been more focused on the Southern anti-suffragists, but the simple answer to that question is yes. They were concerned about race. They just weren't as blatant about it, nor did they use it as sort of a fear tactic like the Southern anti-suffragists did.
And so it's there, but maybe not in the same kind of overt way.
Yes.
Interesting. I mean, it's so hard sometimes to kind of wrap our minds around, in 2020, like you said, you started off, like it's hard for us to wrap our minds around the fact that there were women and that actually were the driving force behind this anti-suffrage movement. And so I think this has been a really interesting talk, and I know that we've all found it. I found it very educating, and so I hope everyone did too, because it has kind of opened up a whole new perspective on the centennial. So thank you so much, Ryan, for this presentation. And thank you all for everyone who has joined us to watch. This is going to be recorded and it's going to be put up on our YouTube page. So be looking out for that so you can share it with all of your friends. Also, remember to join us October 1st for a special program on Wiregrass suffragists, Scotty McKenzie Frazier. And again, next month for our Food for Thought on October 15th. I hope that y'all are all safe and well. And thank you so much for joining us. Bye.
Bye.